September 21st, 454. The Imperial Palace in Ravenna. The air is thick and still, saturated with the smell of swamps and decay. In the throne room, where mosaics still hold the reflections of past glory, the final act of a tragedy that will determine the fate of the Western world is unfolding. Flavius Aetius, patrician, three-time consul, master of both armies, the man known as the last of the Romans, stands before his emperor, Valentinian III. Aetius is unarmed. He has come to discuss state finances, to present tax reports, the routine of power he has carried on his shoulders for 2 decades. He doesn't see the emperor's loyal bodyguards hiding behind the columns. He doesn't sense how the atmosphere is shifting from business to deadly. Suddenly, Valentinian leaps from his throne, his voice breaking into a falsetto as he screams accusations of treason he has rehearsed for weeks. And before Aetius, the greatest general of his era, can comprehend what is happening, the emperor, who has never held anything heavier than a stylus, snatches a sword from his guard Heraclius and strikes the first blow. At this moment, history asks its most piercing question, one that will echo through the centuries. Why? Why was the man who saved Rome from Attila, the victor of dozens of battles, the bulwark of civilization against barbarian chaos, so vilely and senselessly murdered by a ruler who owed him everything? The answer to this question is not a story of a single betrayal, but a requiem for an entire epoch, an autopsy of a rotting imperial body where greatness had become the gravest crime. To understand this drama, we must first see the stage on which it was set. The Western Roman Empire in the mid-5th century is no longer the almighty eagle depicted on its legionary standards. It is an old, sick lion, still fearsome in appearance, but with failing fangs and weakening paws. Its official capital, Rome, has long since become a mere symbol, a ghost of the past. Real power, like a frightened animal, has taken refuge behind the impassable swamps of Ravenna, in a labyrinth of palace intrigues where eunuchs hold more power than senators. The empire is a patchwork of lands from which the threads are being rapidly pulled. Britain is lost forever. Spain is almost entirely conquered by the Suebi Vandals. North Africa, the breadbasket of Rome, has become the pirate kingdom of the Vandal Gaiseric, who dictates his will to the Mediterranean from Carthage. Gaul itself, the heart of the western provinces, has turned into a boiling cauldron where Roman garrisons, like tiny islands, are surrounded by an ocean of hostile tribes. Visigoths in the south, Franks in the north, Burgundians in the east. The legions are no longer composed of Italian citizens. Their ranks are filled with barbarian foederati, mercenaries whose loyalty is as volatile as the price of gold. Emperors are puppets, raised to the throne and deposed by all-powerful barbarian warlords. The world is cracking at the seams, and the very concept of Roman is losing its meaning, transforming from a citizenship into a state of mind, a desperate attempt to maintain order in a world sinking relentlessly into chaos. It was into this twilight era, an age of decay, that a man had to appear who could speak to this new world in its own brutal language. Flavius Aetius was born for this world. He was its flesh and blood. He came into the world around the year 390 in Durostorum, on the Danubian frontier of the empire, a place where civilization constantly met the barbarian world. In his veins flowed the blood of 2 realities that would define his destiny. His mother was a noble and wealthy Roman woman from Italy, a bearer of ancient culture and traditions. His father, Gaudentius, was of Scythian origin and had risen to the highest military posts in the Roman army, the embodiment of that new force, the barbarians in service, who became both the salvation and the curse of the late empire. Aetius was not a pure-blooded aristocrat from the senatorial families of Rome. He was a product of the frontier, a man for whom the line between us and them was blurred from birth. This duality became his greatest gift. Fate seemed to deliberately prepare him for his mission by subjecting him to a unique and harsh education. In his youth, he was sent as a hostage, first to the court of Alaric, king of the Visigoths, and then, far more importantly, to the Huns. This was not a humiliation or an exile. In the politics of the time, it was standard practice to strengthen alliances. But for Aetius, these years became his university. He didn't just live among the nomadic warriors. He learned from them. He saw their way of life, studied their language, mastered their swift, hurricane-like battle tactics, and most importantly, he forged personal connections. He ate with them from the same cauldron, slept in their tents, rode across the steppes. He learned their strengths and weaknesses, their code of honor, and their greed. He learned to think like them, to predict their actions. These years, spent far from the pampered luxury of Roman villas, forged in him a character that was alien and incomprehensible to the court politicians of Ravenna. He was a man of action in a world of words, a pragmatist in a world of dogmas, a wolf in Roman sheep's clothing. Unlike the heroes of ancient myths, the birth of Aetius was not accompanied by prophecies from oracles or divine omens. However, his entire life looks like one great historical foreshadowing, as if the era itself, in its death throes, gave birth to the only physician capable of prolonging its agony. The 5th century did not need another refined orator quoting Virgil or a pious emperor building churches. The age demanded a hybrid, a human bridge, capable of standing with one foot in the crumbling edifice of Roman statehood and the other in the swirling camp of barbarian tribes. It needed someone who could give an order in flawless Latin, and then, turning to his mercenaries, repeat it in the guttural tongue of the Huns. Aetius was that man. His biography is a prophecy written not in words, but in deeds. He was destined to become the last of the Romans, not because he was the most pure-blooded or the noblest, but precisely the opposite. Because he had absorbed the spirit of the new age, the spirit of mixing and survival. His knowledge of the barbarian world was not theoretical, like that of Roman geographers. It was practical, hard-won. He understood that the old methods no longer worked, that the legions in their classic form could no longer protect borders stretching for thousands of miles. He realized that the only real power in this world was control over the flows of barbarian migration. He understood that barbarians could not simply be defeated, but they could be directed, turned against each other, their fury and greed used in the interests of Rome. This philosophy, born in the steppes, was utterly alien to the senators, who saw every non-Roman as a mere savage. To them, Aetius was too much like those he fought. They did not understand that it was this very similarity that made him their only effective defender. Fate did not predict his arrival. It forged him in response to its most terrible challenge. The forge where the unbending character of Aetius was tempered was the vast steppes where he spent his youthful years as a hostage to the Huns. This was not merely a confinement, but an immersion into another universe, a world where survival depended not on noble birth or intrigue, but on personal valor, strength, and the ability to find common ground with the most ferocious warriors on the planet. Here, amidst endless herds of horses and the smell of smoke-filled yurts, he transformed from a Roman aristocrat into a harsh pragmatist. He watched how the Huns prepared for raids, not as an organized army, but as a force of nature, like a swarm of locusts sweeping away everything in its path. He studied their avalanche tactics, swift cavalry charges, feigned retreats, and deadly clouds of arrows fired with incredible speed. He understood that their strength lay not in discipline, but in mobility, ferocity, and unity under a charismatic leader. But most importantly, he formed personal relationships. He befriended young chieftains, including, as some sources claim, the future scourge of God himself, Attila. Whether this was a true friendship or merely a political calculation is impossible to know, but these connections became his greatest asset. He learned to understand their mentality, based on loyalty to a leader, a thirst for plunder, and a deep contempt for settled, effeminate civilization. He saw how easily their loyalty could be bought with gold, and how quickly that loyalty could evaporate. This experience gave him a unique tool that no other Roman commander possessed. He didn't just know the enemy, he understood him from the inside. When he returned to the empire, he would look at the hordes of Goths, Franks, and Alans not as a faceless mob, but as a collection of specific tribes, with specific leaders, ambitions, and weaknesses. This period burned away all sentimentality and illusion from him. He realized that the world was no longer divided into civilization and barbarism, but only into the strong and the weak, predators and prey. And he firmly decided that Rome, under his protection, would be a predator. Aetius's very first appearance on the political stage as an adult was a stunning demonstration of his new, ruthlessly effective style. In the year 425, after the death of Emperor Honorius, chaos reigned in Ravenna. A usurper named Joannes seized power. The legitimate heirs regent, Galla Placidia, fled to Constantinople, and the Eastern Empire dispatched an army to restore her young son, the future Valentinian III, to the throne. At this moment, Aetius, still in his steppe universities, made his move. Using his old connections and a vast amount of gold, he hired a huge army of Huns, some sources say up to 60,000 horsemen, and led them into Italy. His goal was to support the usurper Joannes. This was his first act, and it immediately revealed his nature. For Aetius, there was no legitimate or illegitimate power. There was only power itself, and he was willing to use any force to be on its side. However, he was too late. By the time his Hunnic avalanche reached Italy, the usurper Joannes had already been defeated and executed. It seemed that Aetius had backed the losing side and faced certain death. But here, he demonstrated his second talent, turning military defeat into political victory. Instead of fighting the victorious army of the Eastern Empire, he entered into negotiations. His main bargaining chip was 60,000 wild Huns, standing at the gates of Italy, hungry for plunder. The regent Galla Placidia, mother of the young Valentinian, faced a choice: either start a new, bloody war with an unpredictable outcome, or make a deal. She chose the latter. The Huns received a huge reward and returned to the steppes, and Aetius himself, though formally defeated, received a pardon and was appointed to the highest military post, commander of the forces in Gaul. It was his masterpiece. He had come to Rome at the head of an enemy army, but left as its chief defender. He showed the entire Roman elite that the rules of the game had changed. Power was no longer measured by noble lineage or the support of the Senate. It was measured by the number of swords you could bring to the battlefield, and Aetius had more swords than anyone else. Behind the steel mask of pragmatism and military efficiency, a cold fire burned in Aetius's soul, a deep, almost physical contempt for the political system he was forced to defend. Having spent his youth among warriors for whom honor and valor were the highest values, he returned to a world in Ravenna and Rome that seemed to him a parody of its great past. He saw an imperial court mired in luxury and depravity, where decisions about the fates of millions were made in whispers in dark corridors, where scheming eunuchs had more influence than combat generals. He saw senators who boasted of their ancient lineages but couldn't field a single cohort of soldiers, concerned only with preserving their estates and privileges. He saw emperors who were but pale shadows, puppets in the hands of their mothers, wives, and court cliques. This world disgusted him. He, a man who had faced death in dozens of battles, had to bow and report to pampered youths and self-serving courtiers. This was the source of his main, secret motivation. He saved Rome not so much out of patriotism in the old sense, but out of a sense of responsibility and an awareness of his own exceptionalism. He was convinced that he was the only adult in a room full of capricious and foolish children playing with fire. All this rotten aristocracy, this entire bureaucratic machine, was to him merely a tool, an obstacle to be used or bypassed. His ambition was not to seize the throne. He was too smart for that, and understood that as a half-barbarian, he would never be accepted as emperor. His goal was far more total. He wanted to become the unofficial but absolute ruler, the kingmaker, the shadow dictator who held all the strings of military and political control, leaving the emperor with only the purple robe and ceremonial duties. This arrogance of a genius, convinced of his own rightness and indispensability, would ultimately become one of the main reasons for his downfall. He saved the empire, but he despised its rulers, and they sensed it. Having received command of Gaul, Aetius found the perfect application for his talents. For nearly 2 decades, from the late 420s to the 440s, he waged almost continuous war on all fronts. Gaul during this period resembled a vast chessboard, where the pieces were entire peoples, and the stakes were the survival of Roman civilization west of the Alps. Aetius became the grandmaster of this game. He didn't try to completely destroy all his enemies, as generals of the past might have. He simply lacked the resources. Instead, he acted as both a surgeon and a diplomat, maintaining a delicate balance of power. In the north, he contained the expansion of the Franks, inflicting several sharp defeats but not annihilating them, instead turning them into foederati, obliged to defend the Rhine frontier. In the south, he fought a grueling war against the Visigothic kingdom, centered in Toulouse. He would fight them, besieging their cities, then make peace treaties, using them as a counterweight to other tribes. At the same time, he had to suppress internal threats, rebellions of the so-called Bagudai, desperate peasants, slaves, and deserters who created their own states in the forests and mountains. But the main instrument of his power remained his old friends, the Huns. He constantly used detachments of Hunnic mercenaries as his personal guard, as a scalpel with which he delivered precise and incredibly brutal strikes. They were fast, merciless, and loyal only to the one who paid. It was with the hands of the Huns that he committed one of the most infamous acts of his career, the destruction of the Burgundian kingdom at Worms in 437, an event that would later form the basis of the Germanic epic, the Nibelungenlied. For the Roman aristocracy, this was a horrifying act, using one group of barbarians for the genocide of another. For Aetius, it was simply a harsh necessity, another move in the great game of preserving Roman control over Gaul. He became the unofficial king of this vast province, its only law and shield. Under the iron hand of Aetius, the geopolitical landscape of Western Europe, previously resembling the chaotic Brownian motion of barbarian tribes, began to acquire a certain structure. He did not build new walls or expand the empire's borders. He created an invisible architecture of power based on fear, dependence, and mutual hostility. His main strategy was divide and conquer, brought to perfection. He masterfully manipulated the ancient enmities between various Germanic tribes. He used the Alans, an Iranian tribe known for its heavy cavalry, to keep the Visigoths in check. He set the Huns upon the Burgundians. He forged an alliance with the Franks to secure the northern borders. The Roman Empire under his management ceased to be a monolithic state and turned into the center of a complex confederation of barbarian kingdoms, which were formally its foederati, but in reality obeyed the will of only one man, Aetius. He essentially created the first model of medieval Europe, where a supreme suzerain rules his vassals, granting them land in exchange for military service. However, this system was as effective as it was fragile. It rested solely on his personal authority, his diplomatic genius, and his ability to summon the wild hordes of the Huns at any moment. He deprived the imperial court in Ravenna of any real power over the provinces. Taxes from Gaul went not so much to the imperial treasury as to the maintenance of Aetius's armies and the bribery of barbarian chiefs. The Senate and the emperor could issue as many edicts as they wished, but in the forests of Armorica or on the banks of the Garonne, the only law was the word of Magister Aetius. This created a paradoxical situation. The more successfully Aetius defended the empire from external enemies, the more he undermined the central authority from within. He was not just a general. He himself had become an alternative center of power, and in Ravenna, they understood this perfectly and feared it mortally. Aetius's path to the pinnacle of power was marked not only by brilliant victories over barbarians, but also by the blood of his Roman rivals. The most tragic episode was his struggle with Count Bonifacius, the governor of Africa. Bonifacius was an equally talented commander, and unlike Aetius, enjoyed the patronage of the powerful Empress Galla Placidia. A deadly feud, fueled by court intrigues, developed between Rome's two greatest generals. In 432, their rivalry erupted into open civil war. Their armies clashed at the Battle of Rimini in Italy. During the battle, Aetius's forces were defeated, but according to one version, he personally mortally wounded Bonifacius in a duel. Though he lost the battle, Aetius once again won the war. Bonifacius died a few months later, and Aetius, after fleeing to his Hun allies, soon returned with a new army and forced the court not only to forgive him, but to grant him the highest title of patrician and supreme commander. It was a Pyrrhic victory for Rome. Its two best generals were destroying each other while the Vandals were conquering Africa. Another example of his ruthless efficiency was the aforementioned destruction of the Burgundian kingdom on the Rhine. The Burgundians, who were foederati, had begun to show excessive independence, and Aetius decided to teach them a lesson. He hired the Huns, who in 437 carried out a veritable massacre, destroying, according to chroniclers, King Gunther and 20,000 of his warriors. This act, immortalized in epic poetry, demonstrated his key principle: loyalty is rewarded, betrayal is punished by death, and any means to that end are justified. However, his greatest strategic mistake was his over-reliance on the Huns. He had used them as a tool for so long and so successfully that he failed to notice the tool turning into a monster that would soon slip from his control and threaten its very master. He thought he was holding a wolf on a leash, not realizing the wolf was simply biding its time to tear at his throat. In the complex web of alliances and enmities woven by Aetius, the key threads led to two poles of power. His main ally, his nuclear option for many years, was the Hunnic chieftain Rugila, and later his nephews, Bleda and Attila. Aetius's relationship with the Huns was a symbiosis of predators. He provided them with gold, access to Roman markets, and political cover for their raids on Germanic tribes. They, in turn, gave him an invincible mercenary army that he used to solve his problems both in Gaul and in Italy itself. This alliance allowed him to keep all other enemies of Rome in check. The Visigoths, Franks, Vandals, they all knew that behind Aetius stood the unpredictable and unstoppable force of the steppe nomads. However, this same alliance also created his main enemies, who were not beyond the borders, but within the empire itself. The first and foremost of these was the imperial court in Ravenna, and personally the young Valentinian III, as well as his mother, the regent Galla Placidia. They saw Aetius not as a savior, but as a usurper. He ruled Gaul as his personal kingdom, negotiated with barbarians in his own name, and maintained an army loyal only to him. His constant use of the Huns provoked horror and disgust among the Roman nobility. To them, he was the man who had invited barbarians into the very heart of the empire. Aetius's enemies also included a significant part of the senatorial aristocracy, whose influence he had reduced to nothing. They envied his fame, wealth, and power. In their eyes, he was an upstart, a half-breed who despised their ancient traditions. This internal opposition could not challenge him openly, as long as he was needed to fight external threats. But they waited, weaving intrigues and spreading rumors, preparing to strike him in the back the moment his position faltered. Aetius, busy with his great game on the vast expanses of Europe, for a long time underestimated the danger emanating from these quiet, marbled palaces. He knew how to fight wolves, but he was unprepared for the venom of snakes. By the early 450s, a new, ominous star rose on the horizon of world politics, changing all the rules of the game. Attila, who by then had eliminated his brother Bleda and become the sole ruler of the Hunnic power, had transformed his people from a simple confederation of tribes into a mighty nomadic empire stretching from the Alps to the Caspian Sea. He was no longer a mere mercenary who could be bought with gold. He was the scourge of God, as terrified Christians called him, a conqueror who demanded not tribute, but submission. The old, almost friendly relationship between Aetius and the Huns collapsed. Attila no longer needed an intermediary to communicate with Rome. He decided to speak to it directly, in the language of fire and sword. The pretext for the invasion was the famous story of Honoria, the sister of Emperor Valentinian. Unwilling to marry an elderly senator, she secretly sent her ring to Attila, begging him to save her. The Hunnic leader interpreted this as a marriage proposal and immediately demanded half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. This was, of course, just a pretext. The real reason was that Attila, having conquered all of barbarian Europe, now looked upon the rich but poorly defended provinces of Rome as his rightful prize. Aetius faced the most terrible choice of his life. His main military resource, the force he had relied on for decades, had now become his existential enemy. The man he had possibly known since youth was leading the largest army Europe had ever seen against Rome. All his previous alliances, built on counterbalancing the Hunnic threat, were now in question. Could he convince his old enemies, the Visigoths, to fight alongside him against an even more terrifying foe? It was a crossroads of fate, a moment of truth not just for Aetius, but for all of Western civilization. The year is 451. All of Christendom freezes in terror. Attila's vast army, like a fiery tornado, invades Gaul, sweeping away everything in its path. Cities are burned, populations are massacred. It seems nothing can stop the scourge of God. In this moment of desperation and chaos, the figure of Flavius Aetius reaches his peak of power and historical significance. He is the only one who does not succumb to panic. He is the only one who knows how to confront the Huns. He launches a whirlwind of diplomatic activity that is, in itself, a masterpiece. He travels personally to the camp of Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths, his old and bitter enemy with whom he has fought for most of his life. He convinces him that Attila is a threat to everyone, and that if Rome falls, the Gothic kingdom will fall too. He achieves the near impossible, forging a coalition of mortal enemies. Under his banner gather not only the remnants of the Roman legions, but also Visigoths, Franks, Alans, Burgundians, all those whom he had previously defeated or used in his games. It was an army held together by hatred and fear, and only his genius and authority could keep it from falling apart. The culmination was the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of antiquity. Hundreds of thousands of warriors clashed in a monstrous slaughter that, according to the historian Jordanes, turned a local river into a raging torrent of blood. Aetius proved himself a brilliant tactician. He placed the unreliable Alans in the center, and on the flanks, his loyal Roman troops and the Visigoths. King Theodoric was killed in the fighting, but his son Thorismund, thirsting for revenge, led the Goths in a furious charge. By the end of the day, Attila's army was broken and driven back to its fortified camp. It was Aetius's triumph. He had saved Western Europe from subjugation. At that moment, he was not just a general, he was the savior of civilization, a living legend whose name was spoken with reverence from Britain to Sicily. And it was this peak of glory that marked the beginning of his end. The victory on the Catalaunian Plains, which should have been the crown of Aetius's career and secured his position forever, paradoxically sowed the seeds of his future demise. He had become too great, too powerful. His figure cast such a giant shadow that the already insignificant figure of Emperor Valentinian III was completely lost in it. In Ravenna, the victory was met with mixed feelings. On one hand, there was relief from the elimination of a mortal threat. On the other, there was fear of their own savior. Valentinian, who had spent his entire life in the luxury of the palace, surrounded by flatterers, now had to listen to odes of praise for his general. He, the emperor by birthright, was merely a spectator, while Aetius, the son of a barbarian, decided the fate of the world. This envy, this feeling of humiliation and inadequacy, began to eat away at the emperor's soul, and court intriguers skillfully added fuel to the fire. They whispered to him that the people loved Aetius more than him, that the army was loyal only to him. They reminded him that many Roman emperors in the past had been overthrown by their popular generals. The gratitude Valentinian should have felt began to mutate into its opposite, a dull, irrational hatred. Aetius, intoxicated by his triumph, did not notice or did not want to notice this change. He was accustomed to treating the emperor and his court as something secondary, an annoying nuisance. He continued to act as the de facto ruler, making decisions and giving orders which only strengthened Valentinian's paranoid suspicions. The first crack appeared in the monolith of his power, and it came not from enemy swords, but from the very heart of the empire he had so desperately defended. Immediately after the great battle, Aetius makes a move that to his contemporaries looked like madness or betrayal, but from the perspective of his own strategy, was the height of pragmatism. He allows Attila's defeated army to escape. His Visigothic allies, whose king had fallen in battle, were thirsty for revenge and the complete annihilation of the Huns. They demanded an assault on Attila's fortified camp. But Aetius stops them. He persuades the young Gothic king, Thorismund, to return immediately to Toulouse to consolidate his power, hinting that his brothers might seize the throne in his absence. It was a ruse. The real reason for Aetius's decision was far deeper and more cynical. He understood that the complete destruction of the Huns would upset the very balance of power in Gaul that he had spent decades building. If the Huns disappeared, the Visigoths, his reluctant allies, would become too strong and turn into the main threat to Roman rule. Aetius needed Attila, weakened, humiliated, but alive. He needed a counterweight to the Goths, a boogeyman to frighten other barbarians with. He was playing his geopolitical game, viewing peoples and armies as mere pieces on a board. However, this strategically brilliant move became his fatal political mistake. For his enemies in Ravenna, it was irrefutable proof of their suspicions. Why did he let him go? They whispered to the emperor. Because they are old friends. Because they are in it together. Aetius wants to use Attila to overthrow you and seize power himself. This rumor, venomous and plausible, spread throughout the court. The act that should have demonstrated his supreme intellect was interpreted as an act of treason. Aetius, who considered everyone around him to be pawns, failed to realize that the most important pawn, the emperor, desperately wanted to become a queen and was ready to sweep any piece off the board to do so, even the one that protected him. In the poisonous atmosphere of the imperial court at Ravenna, Valentinian's paranoia found two powerful catalysts that transformed his vague fears into a concrete plan for murder. The first was the senator Petronius Maximus, one of the wealthiest and noblest men in Rome. He held a deadly grudge against the emperor. According to rumors, Valentinian, desiring Maximus's wife, had lured her to the palace under false pretenses and raped her. Humiliated and thirsting for revenge, Maximus knew he could not directly overthrow the emperor as long as the all-powerful Aetius protected him. Therefore, his goal became to eliminate the shield in order to then strike at the emperor himself. He became the chief architect of the conspiracy, using his wealth and influence to turn the Senate and the court against the general. The second key player was the eunuch Heraclius, Valentinian's chief advisor and favorite. In the system of the late Roman Empire, court eunuchs wielded immense power, controlling access to the emperor and managing the palace administration. Heraclius fiercely hated Aetius, seeing him as a direct rival for influence over the monarch. Every triumph for Aetius was a defeat for Heraclius. Every time the emperor was forced to turn to his general for help, the eunuch's authority diminished. Heraclius became the voice of Valentinian's fears, daily whispering poisonous suspicions into his ears. He painted every action of Aetius in the darkest light. His negotiations with barbarians as treason, his popularity with the army as preparation for a rebellion, his wealth as embezzlement of the treasury. Maximus and Heraclius formed a perfect tandem. The aristocrat and the eunuch, a representative of the old nobility and a palace schemer, united with one goal: to convince the weak and suspicious emperor that his only protector was, in fact, his mortal enemy. They patiently and methodically wove a web of lies and half-truths in which the last of the Romans would soon be entangled. The chain of events pulling Aetius inexorably toward his tragic end accelerated in the year 452. Attila, having recovered from his defeat on the Catalaunian Plains, decides to take revenge and invades the very heart of the empire, Italy. The Hunnic horde sweeps through the north of the peninsula like an avalanche, wiping cities like Aquileia, Padua, and Milan from the face of the earth. Terror grips Rome. All eyes turn once again to Aetius. But this time, the great general finds himself trapped by his own successes. His army, assembled for the battle in Gaul, consisted mainly of barbarian federati who had dispersed to their homes after the victory. His Roman legions were depleted and few in number. He simply lacked the forces to give Attila another decisive battle in the open field. All he could do was wage a guerrilla war, harassing the Huns with small raids, but he could not stop them. For the imperial court, this was another blow to his reputation. The invincible savior was powerless. The enemy was at the gates, and the legendary shield of Rome had cracked. This undermined the main argument for Aetius's necessity, his unique ability to defeat enemies. If he could no longer protect even Italy, what was he needed for? Why tolerate his arrogance and power? These questions echoed ever louder in the corridors of the palace in Ravenna, while Aetius himself desperately tried to raise a new army and find a way to halt Attila's relentless advance toward the Eternal City. At the moment when military might proved powerless, a different force took the stage. Diplomacy, robed in ecclesiastical vestments. Since Aetius could not stop Attila on the battlefield, an unusual delegation was sent from Rome to the Hunnic chieftain. It included noble senators, but it was led by a man whose power was not of this world, Pope Leo I. The meeting took place in northern Italy, on the banks of the Mincio River. What exactly the grim nomad and the head of the Christian Church spoke about will forever remain a mystery. Later church legends describe the event as a miracle. Leo, empowered by divine force, and perhaps by a vision of the apostles Peter and Paul with swords in hand, so impressed and terrified Attila that he agreed to spare Rome and withdraw his troops from Italy. Historians, however, point to more prosaic reasons. The Hunnic army was suffering from an epidemic and a shortage of food in the very land they had ravaged. Furthermore, Aetius had finally gathered some forces and begun to threaten their lines of communication. Reinforcements were also on their way from the Eastern Empire. The huge ransom offered by the delegation was likely the final argument. But for the public consciousness, and more importantly, for the imperial court, what happened was this. Where the greatest general had failed, a priest had succeeded. The glory of saving Rome now belonged not to Aetius, but to the growing power of the Church. This further diminished the general's uniqueness and indispensability. He was no longer the only hope. It turned out that the scourge of God could be dealt with without a sword, through the cross and gold. This event became a significant step in the rise of the papacy, and simultaneously, another nail in the coffin of Flavius Aetius's career. Fate itself seemed to conspire against Aetius, removing the pieces from the board that made him necessary. In the year 453, just 1 year after his campaign in Italy, Attila suddenly dies. According to one version, he choked on a nosebleed in his sleep after a boisterous wedding to another of his wives. The death of the leader who held a vast empire in his fist instantly led to its collapse. His sons fought over the inheritance, and the conquered Germanic tribes rebelled. The great Hunnic Empire, which had terrorized Europe for decades, disintegrated as quickly as it had arisen. For Rome, this was the best news in half a century. The main existential threat, the very reason for the existence of an all-powerful commander-in-chief, had simply vanished. As long as Attila was alive, no one dared to touch Aetius, because only he could stand against the Huns. Now Attila was dead. The Huns were defeated and scattered. The threat was gone. And a terrible question hung in the air of the Ravenna palaces. What is Aetius needed for now? From an indispensable savior, he instantly turned into an extremely powerful, popular, and dangerous man with no clear function. His huge army, his influence in the provinces, his wealth, all of this now looked not like an asset to the empire, but a direct threat to the emperor's authority. The disappearance of a common enemy always exposes internal conflicts. And the main conflict of the late Western Empire, between a weak but legitimate monarch and a strong but illegitimate general, now came to the forefront, stripped of all restraining factors. Aetius, the vanquisher of Attila, became a political casualty of his death. Against the backdrop of these changed circumstances, Aetius makes his last and, as it turned out, fatal political move. Seeking to secure his position and ensure a peaceful transfer of power in the future, he proposes to Emperor Valentinian that they unite their families through a dynastic marriage. He asks for the hand of the emperor's daughter, Princess Eudocia, for his son Gaudentius. From Aetius's perspective, this was a logical and wise step. Such a union would end the hostility between his family and the imperial house, guaranteeing stability and the continuity of power. Gaudentius, as the emperor's grandson, would have a legitimate claim to the throne, and Aetius himself could rule peacefully as regent and father-in-law to the future monarch. It was a plan to convert his de facto power into legitimate authority. But for Valentinian and his circle, this proposal sounded like a death sentence. In their paranoid minds, it was the final, irrefutable proof of all their suspicions. Aetius doesn't just want to rule. He wants to seize the throne. He wants to establish his own dynasty. The proposal that was meant to be a bridge to reconciliation became a red flag to a bull. The emperor, in whose veins flowed the blood of the great Theodosius, saw this as a monstrous insult and a direct threat. How could he give his daughter, a bearer of imperial blood, to the son of some Scythian, an upstart, who was moreover born to a barbarian princess? All the rumors, all the intrigues of Heraclius and Petronius Maximus now formed a single, terrifying picture. For Valentinian, the choice became crystal clear. Either he kills Aetius, or Aetius, sooner or later, will kill him and take his crown. The moment for the decisive blow had arrived. The conspiracy was finalized, transforming from parlor whispers into a concrete plan of action. Petronius Maximus and Heraclius, seeing that the seeds of paranoia they had sown had borne abundant fruit in the emperor's soul, began to push him toward decisive measures. They painted grim pictures of the future for him. Aetius, having become even more powerful after his son's wedding, removes him from power, sends him into exile, or simply kills him. They urged Valentinian to act immediately, while Aetius suspected nothing and felt completely secure. They appealed to his male pride, to his sense of self-worth, to his duty as emperor to protect his dynasty. "Will you let this barbarian rule over you?" they asked. "Will you surrender the heritage of your ancestors into the hands of his son?" For the weak and indecisive Valentinian, who had feared making decisions his entire life, this constant pressure became unbearable. The murder of Aetius seemed to him the only way to prove to himself that he was not a puppet, but a true ruler. It was a chance to rid himself of a powerful guardian and his own inferiority complex in one fell swoop. The plan was simple and insidious. Aetius had to be lured to the palace under a plausible pretext, without his loyal barbarian bodyguards. He had to be caught off guard, in a setting where he felt like the master, in the throne room during a report on state affairs. The conspirators knew that Aetius, for all his intelligence, had one vulnerability: arrogance. He despised the emperor and his court, and would never believe that these effete schemers were capable of such a bold and bloody act. The trap was set. All that remained was for the victim to walk into it himself. To fully grasp the depth of this tragedy, one must look into the soul of the killer, Emperor Flavius Placidus Valentinianus III. He ascended the throne as a 6-year-old child and spent his entire life in a golden cage. In his childhood, his domineering mother, Galla Placidia, ruled for him. When he grew up, Aetius wielded the real power. Valentinian never truly ruled. He was a symbol, a banner, but not the source of authority. His life consisted of ceremonies, luxury, and amusements. He knew nothing of the hardships of campaign life, had not seen the horrors of war, did not understand the complexity of governing a vast, crumbling empire. While Aetius spent decades in the saddle, fighting for Rome, Valentinian indulged in pleasures in his palaces in Ravenna. And he hated Aetius with that special, burning hatred that mediocrity always feels for genius, weakness for strength, dependence for independence. Aetius was a living reproach to him, a constant reminder of his own insignificance. Every time he had to listen to his general's reports, he felt like a schoolboy before a strict teacher. Every victory of Aetius that saved his throne was simultaneously a blow to his pride. He owed this man everything, and it was precisely this total dependence that was unbearable for him. He wanted to be not the saved, but the savior. He wanted to be feared and respected, not for his title, but for his deeds. The murder of Aetius became for him a twisted act of emancipation, a slave's rebellion against his master. He thought that by killing his guardian, he would finally become free and able to rule on his own. He did not understand that by killing Aetius, he was killing not a man, but the load-bearing structure of his entire power, and that the roof would inevitably collapse on his own head. Aetius, in turn, fell victim not only to a conspiracy, but also to his own arrogance. The man who could predict the movements of entire peoples and read the souls of barbarian chieftains proved astonishingly blind to the threat emanating from his immediate surroundings. He had spent so many years fighting external, obvious enemies, Huns, Goths, Franks, that he had forgotten how to see danger in the quiet, silk-draped corridors of power. He considered Valentinian and his courtiers to be non-entities, empty space. In his eyes, they were not players, but merely scenery against which he, the protagonist, performed great deeds. He was so confident in his own indispensability, in the belief that the empire would simply collapse without him, that it never occurred to him that he could be eliminated. This confidence turned into fatal carelessness. He continued to visit the palace without his loyal guard of devoted barbarians. He entered the throne room, where the conspirators awaited him, as if it were his own office, ready to reprimand a negligent subordinate. He underestimated the depth of human passions, envy, fear, hatred, which can be a far more destructive force than any army. He thought he was playing chess, where all the pieces move according to the rules, and failed to notice that his opponent, in despair of winning, had simply decided to sweep all the pieces off the board and hit him over the head with it. His genius as a strategist and diplomat, honed in battles and negotiations, proved powerless against the irrational, vengeful nature of human weakness. The last of the Romans fell not because he was a poor warrior, but because he was too poor a psychologist when it came to those he despised. Aetius's final visit to the imperial palace was arranged as a routine business meeting. He was invited to discuss pressing state problems, primarily the lack of money in the treasury. This was a perfect pretext, as financial matters always caused friction between the general, who demanded funds for the army, and the imperial court, which wished to spend them on luxury. Aetius likely prepared for another unpleasant but routine conversation. He entered the reception hall holding scrolls with financial reports. He was alone. His guard remained outside. He was calm and self-assured. The atmosphere in the hall, however, was electric. Valentinian sat on the throne, pale and nervous. Beside him stood the eunuch Heraclius. In the shadows behind the columns, loyal imperial bodyguards lay in wait. Aetius began his report, reading out figures of income and expenditure. And at that moment, Valentinian interrupted him. He jumped up and, instead of discussing taxes, began shouting the accusations that had been building up in his soul for so long. He accused Aetius of all mortal sins, of colluding with Attila, of the defeat in Italy, of aspiring to the throne. For Aetius, this must have been a complete surprise. He probably tried to object, perhaps even with his characteristic condescending irony. He did not understand that this was not a political debate, but a prelude to an execution. This tense, hysterical dialogue was the culmination of a 20-year drama in which one man saved the empire while the other hated him for that salvation. For Valentinian, this was a moment of triumph, the first time in his life he had dared to challenge his all-powerful guardian. And this challenge could only end in blood. The end came in an instant, turning the throne room from a place of audience into a slaughterhouse. After Valentinian's furious tirade, while Aetius was perhaps still trying to respond, the emperor gave a signal. He himself, according to the historian Prosper of Aquitaine, snatched the sword from Heraclius's scabbard and struck Aetius the first blow in the chest. At the same moment, the conspirators rushed out from behind the columns and fell upon the unarmed general. This was not a duel. It was a cowardly, brutal beating. The man who had survived hundreds of battles, who had looked death in the face on the Catalaunian Plains, fell to the marble floor of the palace under the blows of court assassins. The paradox at the heart of their relationship was resolved in the bloodiest and most irrational way possible. The savior was killed by the saved. The shield of the empire was shattered by the hand of the one it protected. There was a terrible, twisted irony in this act. Aetius, who had spent his life using barbarians to defend Rome, died like the most defenseless of Romans, at the hands of those he considered weaklings and cowards. Valentinian, having struck the blow, likely felt all-powerful, freed from his chains. He did not realize he had just committed political suicide and signed the death warrant for the entire Western Roman Empire. The murder of Aetius was not the solution to a problem. It was its monstrous exacerbation, an act of madness that opened the floodgates for the final terminal deluge. Immediately after the murder, as the body of the last of the Romans still lay on the floor, a deafening silence fell, in which one could almost hear the cracking of the crumbling empire. Valentinian, intoxicated by his victory, boasted of his deed to a courtier. The response he received has gone down in history and serves as an epitaph for both him and his act. Sire, a senator, also reputedly named Aetius, is said to have replied, "I do not know whether your actions are good or bad, but I know for certain that you have cut off your right hand with your left." This phrase encapsulated the entire essence of the catastrophe. The emperor, in trying to rid himself of a protector who was too strong, had deprived himself of all protection. The murder of Aetius decapitated the army and the entire defense system of the West. His loyal barbarian foederati, whom he alone could keep in check, were left without a master and transformed from defenders into marauders. His veterans, scattered throughout Gaul, were enraged and thirsty for revenge. The entire complex system of checks and balances that he had built over decades collapsed in an instant. Valentinian thought that by removing Aetius, he himself would become strong, but he only exposed his own weakness to the entire world. Now there was no one who could protect Italy from the Vandal Gaiseric, threatening from Africa, or stop the Goths and Franks from seizing the remnants of Gaul. The death of Aetius was a signal to all of Rome's enemies that the lion was dead, and it was time to divide its skin. The legacy of Aetius became apparent almost instantly in the bloody chaos that followed his death. Just 6 months later, in March of 455, Emperor Valentinian III was assassinated. He was cut down by 2 barbarian soldiers, former comrades of Aetius, who were acting on the instigation of the vengeful senator Petronius Maximus. The man who had cut off his own right hand did not outlive it by more than a few months. Immediately after, a new catastrophe befell Rome. Learning of the emperor's death and the ensuing chaos, the Vandal king Gaiseric sailed from Carthage and landed unopposed at the mouth of the Tiber. There were no troops in the city, no leader capable of organizing a defense. The shield of Rome lay in his grave. The Vandals entered the Eternal City and for 2 weeks plundered it with methodical cruelty. Thousands of citizens were killed or taken into slavery. Priceless treasures accumulated over centuries were carried off on Vandal ships. The sack of Rome in 455 was a shock to the entire ancient world and a direct, undeniable consequence of the murder of Aetius. Without him, the agony of the Western Roman Empire, which he had so long and skillfully prolonged, accelerated dramatically. In the following 20 years, a succession of puppet emperors would occupy the throne, until in 476, the last of them, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian chieftain Odoacer. A look through the centuries has solidified Aetius's status as a tragic, almost mythical figure. He remains in history as the last of the Romans, not by blood, but by spirit. He was the last man who possessed the will, the talent, and the strength to defend the idea of a unified Roman Empire in a world that had long ceased to believe in it. He was a titan who single-handedly tried to hold up a falling sky, only to be betrayed and killed by the very people who stood beneath that sky, praying for salvation. Now, having assembled all the pieces of this tragic mosaic, we can give a final and comprehensive answer to the main question posed in the title. Why was the victor of Attila killed by the emperor he saved? Flavius Aetius was not killed by treason or conspiracy. He was killed by his own glory. His greatness became unbearable for the world of mediocrities he protected. The murder of Aetius was not so much an act of cold political calculation as a crime of passion, born from the most destructive of human feelings, existential envy. Valentinian III destroyed Aetius not because he believed in his betrayal, but because he could not bear the light of his triumph, which only highlighted his own insignificance more brightly. Every victory for Aetius, every city saved, every hymn of praise in his honor was a personal insult to the emperor, a reminder of who the real master was. Aetius saved Valentinian's throne, but in the process, he destroyed his ego, his male pride, his sense of self-worth. And for a weak, vain, and insecure man like Valentinian, this proved to be a crime deserving of death. He was also killed because he had outlived his era. He was a man of war at a time when everyone around him desperately wanted peace. When the main threat in the form of Attila disappeared, Aetius himself, with his army and power, became the main threat to the rotten political system. Ultimately, the paradox of his fate is simple. The system he saved was already so sick that it could not tolerate the presence of its own savior. It preferred to commit suicide by destroying its own immune system, just to get rid of a medicine that seemed too bitter. The tragedy of Flavius Aetius, the last of the Romans, extends far beyond the history of one individual or one era. It is a timeless, universal story about the nature of power and human psychology, a lesson that repeats itself time and again throughout history. His fate is a bitter reminder that in systems in a state of decay, the greatest threat to a weak ruler is not an external enemy, but an indispensable and overly successful subordinate. The story of Aetius shows how the fear of being replaced, the fear of looking weak in the shadow of the strong, can be more powerful than the instinct for self-preservation and the interests of the state. It is a story of how civilizations, weakened by internal contradictions, sometimes destroy the very people who can protect them, preferring the illusion of control in chaos to real salvation at the cost of their own perceived importance. The fate of Aetius is a warning to all geniuses, all saviors, all indispensable experts. Your strength and your talent, which saved the system, are at the same time a mortal threat to those who formally lead it. Ultimately, the story of the victor of Attila, killed by the emperor he saved, leaves us with a deep and unsettling question. What is more dangerous for a world on the brink of an abyss, an external enemy threatening destruction, or the internal rot that, out of fear and envy, kills its last hope? The answer that the history of the 5th century gives us, unfortunately, leaves no room for optimism.